وهذه المرة دعونا ننتقل إلى عالم الأوبر الشحن، حيث أعلنت شركة تراكر والعاملة في مجال الشحن في الشرق الأوسط عن إتمام أول عملية توريق لمستحقات تجارية بقيمة تصل إلى 300 مليون دولار مع بنك أبو ظبي التجاري، والذي تولى دور المرتب والمقرض الوحيد لهذه العملية. ويهدف التمويل إلى دعم السيولة ورأس المال العامل للشركة في الإمارات والسعودية وتركيا. وتبرز أهمية الصفقة لأنها جاءت قبل أيام من اضطراب الشحن عبر مضيق هرمز، وهذا ما زاد الاعتماد على النقل البري والموانئ البديلة. وتقول الشركة بأن التمويل ساعدها على توسيع عملياتها وخدمة عملاء كبار في فترة ضغط لوجستي حاد. وللحديث أكثر حول هذه الصفقة اليوم الفريدة والأولى التي تشهدها المنطقة، معنا غوراف بسواس وهو المؤسس والرئيس التنفيذي لتراكر. أهلا بك غوراف. دعنا نبدأ من هذه الصفقة اليوم التي أغلقتموها ب300 مليون دولار تسهيلات عبر ما يسمى في توريق الذمم التجارية. للمشاهد اليوم الغير مختص، هل يمكنك أن تفسر لنا ما الذي تعني هذه الصفقة وهيكلتها؟
Sure. So the 300 million US dollar facility is a non-recourse, securitization of working capital financing. So this is one of the first of its kind that is done in the region, and it is multi-jurisdiction. It scales across UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, which are the three biggest markets that we operate in. And it's unique because for a business like ours, which is asset light, does not have the typical asset book of a corporate business that typically banks would want to finance, where most of our receivables are the most valuable asset on our balance sheet. So the way it works is we invoice, every invoice we send to a client becomes a contracted receivable. That receivable then goes into a security bucket that this facility then finances, and we use that money to pay our suppliers in rapid terms. And as the business grows, this bucket keeps becoming bigger, up to the facility size.
يعني 30 60 90 يوم كيف تعمل؟
Sure. So obviously, different companies would have different payment terms. The most common payment terms that we see is 30 days, but sometimes for large entities and semi-government entities, it can go as much as 90 days. And that's one of the biggest constraints to growth for small companies, because sometimes they're not sophisticated enough to even invoice, forget about them having the ability to fund a working capital cycle of 30, 60, 90 days. And that's where businesses like ours, where we don't own fleet, we use our technology to orchestrate other people's fleet, but at the same time, we take away these kind of constraints to growth so they can focus on growing their core business rather than trying to figure out working capital financing. And these problems become more and more challenging when you are doing smaller numbers. A $300 million facility is significantly more complex and it takes a long time, but there are more institutions willing to fund a larger ticket than somebody financing $1 million dirhams, for example.
طيب غوراف، اليوم معظم الستارت ابس تتجه الى الفي سيز او البي ايز او حتى اصدار ربما سندات ودين. لماذا اخترتم هذه الطريق وكيف تختلف اليوم عن باقي اساليب التمويل؟
So listen, we have amazing equity partners. We've been quite fortunate that people had the conviction of building the regional Uber of trucks. So we've got everybody from a Mubadala, ADQ, Saudi Technology Ventures, Riyadh Taqaniya Fund, IFC, InvestCorp, who've all been our equity partners. However, I think equity is the right capital to fund your vision, fund the innovation. TruKKer has built a very strong technology network over the last 8-9 years. And I think now this next phase of growth, where working capital is a real constraint to growth or an enabler of growth, I think equity is not the right kind of capital to fund working capital. So I think we've used a good amount of equity, and startups that are raising in the region find equity capital to be the easiest and the fastest to raise, as long as they have a business that validates investor criteria. But I think mature startups who have now positive unit economics, have achieved enterprise scale in fintech, logitech. I think this transaction is proof of the pudding that there is regional banks who are willing to do internationally similar complex transactions like this one.
غراف، ربما أكثر ما يعقد أيضا هذه العملية هو أن اليوم هذه الصفقة تشمل عدة أسواق. نتحدث عن الإمارات، نتحدث عن السعودية، نتحدث عن تركيا. فكيف تمكنتم اليوم من الوصول إلى هذه الصفقة في ظل لدينا قوانين مختلفة لكل دولة؟
That's, listen, this transaction had so many complexities, and we were fortunate to have some international global law firms like, White and Case, Paul Hastings, who were counsels advising the transaction. But if you simplify this is a jurisdiction where the UAE and Saudi have a Murabaha kind of a facility, which forms to be the security structure. And then Turkey has a senior, facility where all of this is under one master agreement. And there is a security agent based out of Ireland. HSBC is acting as the security trustee and the bank account across all these jurisdictions. So it's a true international capital market kind of a transaction on financing. And I think we've been quite lucky to find the partners like ADCB, who's the sole arranger and the sole underwriter, to have the patience and the stamina to get this through.
ممتاز. واليوم إذا أردنا نتحدث عن انعكاس هذه الصفقة على أعمال التراكر، هل الأولوية اليوم للتوسع الجغرافي، لتحسين اليوم الوركينج كابيتال بالنسبة للتراكر، أم لديكم أهداف أخرى أيضا تسعون إليها؟
So listen, the regional supply chain is going through a massive shift. And I think some of that shift that is caused by the conflict is permanent in nature. And I think we've seen that while we have some of the best ports in the world, unfortunately, some of those ports are inside the Persian Gulf. And I think that's where the dependency on land freight has been significantly higher than, pre-28th of February. So I think that ability to have a transaction of this kind right now helps us to, scale with high quality, clients who are keeping the food supply in the regions, ensuring that raw materials are coming to our manufacturers, and we are able to export the cargo that the world depends on. So I think it's very, lucky for TruKKer to have done this deal where it is financing the largest freight operator in the region to have higher financing muscle to keep focusing on the shift towards land freight and the shift towards alternate supply chains. So I think it's a landmark transaction from that context also for the region.
يعني طرحت موضوع هام جدا غراف، بأن اليوم التعطل الذي نشهده في مضيق هرمز، يعني من الصدف بأن تراكر كانت موجودة في هذه الوضعية اليوم. ولكن السؤال عند عودة فتح المضيق، هل تعتقد بأن الأعمال ستستمر في النمو؟ هل الاختلاف الذي شهدناه في سلاسل التوريد برأيك سيستمر لفترة ما بعد فتح المضيق؟
Well, listen, for us, the growth in demand has not been a constraint because, the trucking sector, if you look at it anywhere in the world, is amongst the top 3 sectors, like construction or agriculture. So we could continue growing without any, crisis kind of spike. We could keep growing at 30-40% annually for the next 20-30 years. Because even being the biggest digital freight operator, we are still less than 1% market share in the trucking space. So it's a massive sector. But I think for the crisis impact, I think the region, the GCC, has realized that we move a lot of cargo through a traffic light that we don't control. Somebody else makes it red and green. And I think this will force investments to accelerate across these alternate routes of the ports of Sharjah, Oman on the east coast, and ports of Saudi Arabia on the west. And I think trucking and land connectivity and railways is going to play a much stronger role in having this redundancy built in. So even after the Strait of Hormuz opens up and our, the amazing ports that we have that start functioning again, I think the region will continue to have this redundancy active, that we are not all fully dependent on, a few ports.
سؤال أخير اليوم ليس لتراكر، ولكن هل من الإمكان اعتبار اليوم هذه الصفقة التي أجريتموها أن تكون ربما اليوم باب جديد للتمويل لشركات تكنولوجية اليوم ستارت ابس في المنطقة، عوضا عن التوجه فقط للتمويل عبر الإكويتي أو الدات؟
No, absolutely. I think the startups, especially in logitech, fintech, enterprise kind of business, where the counterparty is a matured receivable financing. I think, and startups by design, there are very few which are asset heavy. So this opens up the precedent that a regional bank was able to execute a complex transaction. I think this will encourage a lot of startups and the banks. I think capital is not short in the region. There is a lot of capital. You can see that with the amount of private debt and the venture debt, that has been there. But I think this kind of traditional bank getting into financing a technology startup at pretty much benchmark prices. We halved our cost of capital refinancing our venture debt by bank financing. So I think it's definitely encouraging. Whether this kind of a structure will finance early stage startups, I don't know. I think it will take a bit more conviction by our local LPs and capital. But I think for mature startups with positive unit economics, I think this should be, like I said, proof of the pudding that this can be done by a regional bank structured by people in the region.
وأنا أشكرك غراف بسواس المؤسس والرئيس التنفيذي لتراكر ومبروك مجددا على هذه الصفقة. شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you, Hassan.